The morning of the garden party arrived with the sort of perfect September weather that seemed almost deliberately orchestrated, as if nature itself were collaborating in Victoria Ashford's vision of an impeccable event. The sky was a pale, cloudless blue, and the temperature hovered at precisely that point where one could comfortably wear a light jacket without seeming overdressed. Miss Marple, dressed in her best lavender dress and a cardigan she'd completed years ago, arrived at Thornfield Manor at 2:30, which was early enough to observe the final preparations without being so early as to seem over-eager. The grounds had been transformed. Tables with cream-colored linens dotted the lawn in conversational clusters, each one decorated with small arrangements of dahlias and late-blooming roses. A string quartet had been positioned near the rose garden, though they weren't yet playing. Caterers moved efficiently among the tables, setting out tiered stands of finger sandwiches, small cakes and scones. It was, Miss Marple admitted to herself, all quite beautifully done. Victoria had left nothing to chance. Victoria herself was holding court near the entrance to the garden, directing people toward their seats with the precision of a military commander. She wore dove grey, a colour that suggested both authority and mourning, though there was nothing mournful in her demeanour. Her expression was taut, focused, almost as though she were performing rather than hosting. Miss Marple had learned that such expressions often indicated anxiety masquerading as control. Catherine Wynne was assisting with the seating arrangements, and here Miss Marple noticed something interesting. The girl moved with a studied grace, but her eyes followed Simon Ashford as he helped adjust the position of one of the tables. When Simon glanced in her direction, Catherine turned away quickly, occupying herself unnecessarily with the arrangement of a floral centerpiece. It was the sort of choreography that suggested either recent intimacy or deliberate avoidance, possibly both. Miss Marple filed this observation away with the same care one might use to file an important letter. Peter Ashford was smoking a cigarette near the garden's perimeter, ostensibly watching the setup but actually watching Catherine. His expression was difficult to read. Something between amusement and resentment flickered across his weathered features. He was Victoria's brother-in-law, a man who had never quite achieved the success his family seemed to expect from him. There was about him the air of someone perpetually disappointed, both by life and by himself. He had never married, though Miss Marple knew from village gossip that there had been a young woman once, years ago, before some unspecified misunderstanding had ended things. Gerald Whitmore was nowhere to be seen initially, though Miss Marple spotted him eventually, emerging from the house with a clipboard in his hand. His manner was businesslike, professional, yet there was something about the way he avoided making eye contact with Victoria that suggested recent friction. When their paths crossed near one of the tables, Victoria's greeting to him was polite but distinctly cool, and his response was even more guarded. They spoke like people who had recently discovered they could no longer trust one another. By 3:00, the garden party had begun in earnest. Guests arrived in a steady stream, greeting one another with the particular warmth that village social occasions demanded. The vicar and his wife made an appearance. Dr. Hastings attended with his practice nurse, Miss Pemberton, a competent woman of 45 who had been caring for the village's medical needs since the previous doctor's retirement. Various shopkeepers, teachers, and local families filled the spaces between the tables. The string quartet began playing a gentle arrangement of Vivaldi. Miss Marple accepted a cup of tea from a passing server and settled herself into a comfortable chair positioned with a clear view of the gathering. From this vantage point, she could observe the interplay of social dynamics without appearing to do so. The gift of age was that people rarely suspected one of careful observation. They assumed instead that one was merely enjoying the pleasant surroundings and the pleasant company. It was during this period of seeming tranquility that she first noticed the tension beginning to crystallize. Simon and Catherine were not speaking to one another, yet they were acutely aware of each other's presence. Victoria's frequent glances toward the house suggested anxiety about something internal. Peter had moved closer to Catherine, engaging her in conversation that seemed to amuse rather than distress her, a fact that appeared to irritate Simon considerably, judging by the tightness around his mouth. And Gerald Whitmore, Miss Marple observed with particular interest, had positioned himself near the entrance to the house, as though maintaining an escape route. His eyes kept returning to something or someone with an intensity that suggested unresolved business. When his gaze landed on Peter Ashford, there was undeniable animosity in the look, the kind of resentment that had been building for some time. By 4 o'clock, as the party reached its convivial peak and the garden was filled with laughter and the clink of teacups, Miss Marple had formed several quiet conclusions about the undercurrents flowing beneath the day's pleasant surface. There were secrets here, certainly. There was tension, resentment, and what appeared to be romantic complication. But as she sat with her tea cooling beside her, she could not yet discern which of these small disturbances would ultimately prove fatal. For she was quite certain, with the intuition born of long experience, that something in this gathering would end in more than social discomfort. The incident that would later be remembered as the beginning of everything occurred at precisely 4:45 in the afternoon, though few people noticed the exact moment it happened. Miss Marple noticed, of course, because she had been watching the drawing-room window, the large bay window that overlooked the garden from the house's eastern face. She had noticed it because Catherine Wynne had excused herself from a conversation with the vicar's wife some 10 minutes earlier, claiming a need to refresh her tea, and had not returned. What Miss Marple observed was the sudden appearance of Gerald Whitmore at that same window, looking outward into the garden. His face, framed by the glass, bore an expression of such acute distress that it momentarily broke through his customary professional composure. He stood there for perhaps 30 seconds, staring at something or someone in the crowd below, and then he turned away with a movement that suggested either anger or desperation. Possibly both. 3 minutes later, Catherine emerged from the house, but she did not rejoin the conversation she had abandoned. Instead, she moved directly toward Peter Ashford, who was standing near the refreshment table, and spoke to him in urgent, low tones. Whatever she said caused him to set down his teacup with unusual care and excuse himself from the elderly widow he had been entertaining. The two of them walked together toward the garden's far boundary, where a hedge of substantial yew trees created a natural screen from the main party. Simon Ashford, who had been engaged in conversation with Dr. Hastings about some matter of property taxation, suddenly lost interest in the discussion. His eyes had followed Catherine and Peter, and Miss Marple observed the moment when his jaw tightened and his hands curled into fists before he deliberately relaxed them. He remained where he was, but his attention was no longer with the doctor. Victoria, observing from her position near the house, noticed this as well. She set down her teacup with a deliberateness that suggested conscious control and began moving through the crowd toward her nephew. Before she reached him, however, she encountered Gerald Whitmore, who had emerged from the house once more. The two of them exchanged a brief conversation, barely 2 minutes in duration, but Miss Marple, who had decades of experience reading the language of unspoken communication, understood that important information was being conveyed. Victoria's face, already tight with tension, grew considerably paler. The string quartet, oblivious to these various undercurrents, continued playing Vivaldi with undeterred cheerfulness. Most of the party guests remained unaware that anything unusual was transpiring. They chatted and ate scones and admired the gardens with the comfortable absorption of people enjoying a pleasant afternoon. Only a small subset of the gathering seemed attuned to the gathering storm. Miss Marple, Simon, Victoria, and Gerald, each observing the others with varying degrees of concern. It was the vicar who first sensed that something had genuinely gone wrong. He was a man of 60, with a particular sensitivity to human distress that came from years of pastoral care. He had noticed Victoria's pallor and Gerald's agitation, and he approached Victoria with the gentle inquiry that was his way. Miss Marple watched as he spoke to her, watched as Victoria's composure, that carefully maintained facade of perfect hostessing, began to crack. The vicar's expression shifted from concern to something more grave. Within moments, Victoria had quietly requested that Gerald accompany her into the house. They left together, moving quickly but without the appearance of panic. Simon made as though to follow them, but Victoria's sharp glance in his direction stopped him. He remained where he was, but every muscle in his body seemed to vibrate with suppressed anxiety. Catherine and Peter emerged from their seclusion near the yew trees, perhaps 5 minutes later. Catherine's eyes were red-rimmed, as though she had been crying, and there was about her a brittleness that hadn't been present before. Peter's expression was unreadable, but his hand remained on her elbow with what appeared to be both protective and possessive intent. When they reached the main party, Simon immediately excused himself from Dr. Hastings and intercepted them. "Where have you been?" he asked Catherine, his voice low but edged with something sharp enough to cut. "For a walk," Catherine replied, and her voice carried a note of defiance. "Is that not permitted?" "Not with him," Simon said, and the intensity in his gaze was sufficient to cause Peter to shift protectively closer to Catherine. "That's quite enough," Peter said quietly. "The girl is free to speak with whomever she chooses." Miss Marple, observing this small but significant exchange, noted that Simon's hands had curled into fists once more, and this time he did not relax them. She also noted that Catherine was avoiding his eyes, and that Peter's protective gesture contained an element of satisfaction that went beyond simple defense of the girl's independence. At that precise moment, Victoria re-emerged from the house with Gerald close behind her. Her face was ashen, and she moved directly to the vicar, speaking to him in urgent undertones. The vicar's expression grew graver still, and he immediately nodded in agreement with whatever Victoria was saying. It was only then that Miss Marple understood with absolute certainty that something terrible had occurred. The garden party, with its perfect weather and elegant appointments, had been transformed by invisible hands from a pleasant social occasion into the scene of a crisis. The question was not whether something dreadful had happened. Clearly it had. The question was what, precisely, that dreadful thing might be. The vicar's conversation with Victoria lasted only a few moments, but it was sufficient to set in motion a series of events that would transform the pleasant garden party into something altogether different. He nodded once, solemnly, and then moved with surprising purpose toward Dr. Hastings, who was in the process of selecting a cucumber sandwich from one of the refreshment tables. The two men spoke briefly, and Miss Marple observed the doctor's initial expression of confusion give way to something more grave. He set down his plate and followed the vicar back toward the house. Victoria, meanwhile, had turned her attention to her assembled guests with the air of someone steeling herself for an unpleasant announcement. She raised her voice, not loudly, but with sufficient clarity that the string quartet, recognizing the interruption, gradually ceased their playing. The garden fell into an attentive silence, that particular quality of quiet that descends when people sense that something important is about to be said. "I'm afraid," Victoria began, and her voice was steady despite the pallor that remained in her cheeks, "that we must bring this afternoon's gathering to a rather premature conclusion. Something has occurred at Thornfield that requires immediate attention. I do apologize for the inconvenience, but I must ask that you all return to your homes. The vicar will provide any necessary explanation." For a moment, there was only confusion. A woman near the rose garden asked whether the weather had turned suddenly, an innocent question born from complete bewilderment. The vicar stepped forward, his clerical collar catching the afternoon light, and his voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of terrible news. "There has been an accident," he said carefully. "In the house, I'm afraid that Gerald Whitmore has met with a serious injury. The doctor is attending to him now. For the safety and comfort of everyone present, Victoria has quite rightly decided that this gathering should end. If you would all be so kind as to depart in an orderly fashion, I'm certain that will be for the best. An accident. The word hung in the air like something fragile and unconvincing. Miss Marple watched the faces of those around her transform from pleasant afternoon contentment into something more complicated. Shock, certainly, but also curiosity, and in some cases, she noted with particular interest, something that looked remarkably like fear. Simon's face had gone very white. Catherine had gripped Peter's arm, though whether in distress or in something else was difficult to determine. Peter himself appeared almost unsurprised, as though some portion of him had been anticipating this development. The various village guests began to gather their belongings and their children, moving toward the garden's exit with the particular reluctance of people who sensed that they were departing before the most significant part of the story had been revealed. "What sort of accident?" asked Mrs. Pemberton, the practice nurse, her professional instincts overriding social protocol. "How severe is the injury? Should we summon an ambulance?" The vicar hesitated, which was answer enough. "The doctor is making that determination now," he said, "but I think it best if everyone departs for the moment. This is not a situation where additional assistance will be particularly helpful." This phrasing, "this is not a situation where additional assistance will be particularly helpful," struck Miss Marple as notably unusual. It suggested something more than a simple accident, something that had moved beyond the realm of straightforward medical emergency. She rose from her chair with the unhurried grace of someone who had been anticipating a need to do so, and she began to gather her handbag and cardigan. As she moved toward the house, for she had no intention of departing before discovering what had actually transpired, she observed that Victoria was watching her. Their eyes met for a brief instant, and in that glance, Miss Marple perceived something that she had not previously noted. Victoria was not merely distressed by whatever had occurred. She was relieved by it. Beneath the shock and the concern was a current of something almost like satisfaction. Inside the house, in what appeared to be Victoria's private study, Gerald Whitmore lay on the floor beside an ornate desk. Dr. Hastings was kneeling beside him, though it was abundantly clear, even to Miss Marple's untrained eye, that the doctor's ministrations were rather more perfunctory than urgent. Gerald's face bore an expression of permanent surprise, and his skull had been struck with sufficient force that the carpet beneath him was stained a deep, dark red. Beside his outstretched hand lay a decorative brass paperweight in the shape of a horse's head. A beautiful object, Miss Marple noted, now rendered terrible by its circumstance. Her eyes traced the path from the paperweight to Gerald's wound, and she understood immediately that this object had been the instrument of his demise. The vicar and Victoria stood in the doorway, both looking at the body with the particular stillness that comes from confronting death for the first time. Miss Marple stepped past them into the room, and as she did so, she noticed something that the others had apparently overlooked, a small smear of blood on the edge of the desk, at a height that suggested it had come from someone's hand, not from Gerald's wound. She said nothing. Instead, she simply observed, her mind cataloguing details with the precision that had served her so well over so many years. A murder, then. Not an accident at all. Someone in that garden party had just killed Gerald Whitmore, and they were still present, still performing their role in this terrible drama. The police arrived within the hour, though Miss Marple suspected that the vicar had telephoned them almost immediately after discovering Gerald's body. Inspector Thornton was a competent man in his early 50s, with the methodical manner of someone who had investigated perhaps 100 cases of varying severity, and had learned to approach each one with professional detachment. He arrived with Sergeant Mills, a younger man with sharp eyes and an unfortunate tendency toward premature conclusions, precisely the sort of officer who could be both helpful and problematic depending on the circumstances. The vicar had managed to keep most of the garden guests from departing immediately, which Miss Marple recognized as both sensible and somewhat remarkable given that such requests were rarely met with compliance. Victoria had made a brief announcement to the assembled group that they were requested to remain for police questioning, and though several people had protested with varying degrees of indignation, most had acquiesced. The string quartet had long since packed their instruments. The caterers had been dismissed. The garden party had transformed into something that resembled a crime scene with the added complication of approximately 80 witnesses. Inspector Thornton established himself in Victoria's drawing room, which afforded a view into the study where Gerald's body lay, pending the arrival of the forensic team from the county town. He began by interviewing Victoria first, which was both predictable and, Miss Marple noted, somewhat problematic. Victoria, after all, had been in the house when Gerald died, and her account of events would likely shape the officer's initial understanding of the crime's circumstances. Miss Marple positioned herself near the drawing-room window, ostensibly admiring the view but actually listening with the careful attention of someone who had spent 70 years perfecting the art of apparent distraction. Through the partially open door, she could hear Victoria's crisp, measured recitation of events. Gerald had excused himself from the party at approximately 4:30. She had noticed his distress and had followed him inside to inquire whether anything was amiss. She had found him in the study, and moments later, when she had attempted to speak with him about some matter of estate business, she had discovered him already deceased. It was a perfectly reasonable account, delivered with precisely the right mixture of concern and clinical detail to suggest honesty. Yet Miss Marple observed that Victoria's hands, folded neatly in her lap, displayed a tension that contradicted the evenness of her voice. More tellingly, when Inspector Thornton had asked what business she had wished to discuss with Gerald, Victoria had paused, just for an instant, but long enough that Miss Marple had caught it, before responding that she had merely wished to compliment him on the floral arrangements he had coordinated. This was, Miss Marple knew with absolute certainty, a lie. The flower arrangements had been Victoria's responsibility, not Gerald's. After Victoria came Peter Ashford, who provided a rambling account of his afternoon that emphasized his position in the garden, away from the house, and his conversation with various guests. He had not, he claimed, been aware that anything was amiss until the vicar had begun dispersing the party. When asked about his relationship with Gerald, Peter had become oddly defensive, insisting that he barely knew the man, and that any suggestion of conflict was pure speculation. Then came Simon Ashford, whose interview was considerably shorter and more fraught with tension. Simon had been in the garden as well, he said, though he admitted to having gone inside briefly to use the facilities at approximately 4:15. He had not entered the study, had not seen Gerald, and had no idea what could have prompted such violence. His hands shook slightly as he spoke, and he required water twice during the interview. When Catherine Wynne was called, Miss Marple observed that she wore the particular pallor of someone who had been crying privately and had attempted to repair her appearance with limited success. She corroborated Peter's account of their whereabouts, though Inspector Thornton's expression suggested he had noted the potential bias in such corroboration. Catherine seemed almost numb as she answered questions, responding in monosyllables where possible and volunteering nothing beyond what was directly asked. It was during Catherine's interview that Sergeant Mills made his first significant observation. He had been examining the study in preliminary fashion and had emerged with a decorative paperweight secured in an evidence bag. He showed it to Inspector Thornton, noting that there was blood on the object but that the handle area appeared to have been wiped or cleaned, imperfectly, but enough to suggest deliberate effort to remove fingerprints. This observation appeared to crystallize something in the inspector's mind. He asked Catherine directly whether she had touched the paperweight at any time during the afternoon. Catherine's eyes widened slightly, and she immediately denied it. Yet Miss Marple, observing from her position near the window, noted that Catherine's denial came accompanied by a glance toward Peter Ashford, who was standing in the hallway awaiting his turn for further questioning. It was precisely this moment, this small, almost imperceptible exchange of looks, that Miss Marple understood the case's fundamental architecture. Not who had killed Gerald, necessarily, but why the crime had occurred and what role each of the primary suspects had played. The solution to the mystery was not yet fully formed in her mind, but the essential structure was there, waiting only for confirmation through careful observation. Inspector Thornton, meanwhile, had reached a preliminary conclusion that Miss Marple could read in his expression. He was convinced that one of the young men, either Simon or Peter, had committed the murder, likely in a moment of rage sparked by some romantic complication involving Catherine. It was a logical enough theory, the sort that would satisfy most investigations and lead to an arrest within days. Yet Miss Marple knew better. The truth, as it usually was, lay in the details that nobody else was bothering to observe, in the small gestures and the careful deceptions that people employed to hide their deepest motivations. She settled herself more comfortably in her chair and waited for the next development, knowing that the real investigation, the one that mattered, was only just beginning. By the time evening had descended upon Thornfield Manor and most of the garden party guests had been released pending further inquiries, the house itself had taken on the atmosphere of a fortress under siege. Inspector Thornton and Sergeant Mills had established themselves in Victoria's study, carefully avoiding the adjacent room where Gerald's body remained pending removal, and they had begun conducting more detailed interviews with those individuals deemed relevant to the investigation. The local police constable had been stationed at the main entrance to prevent unauthorized comings and goings. Miss Marple, who had never been formally interviewed, found herself in the peculiar position of being simultaneously present and overlooked. The vicar had quietly asked whether she intended to remain at Thornfield, and she had replied that she thought she might, if Victoria would permit it, as she found the circumstances quite distressing and would prefer to avoid traveling home alone in the gathering darkness. This explanation, while not entirely dishonest, masked her genuine intention to remain where she could observe the unfolding dynamics of the household, now that Gerald Whitmore's death had disrupted whatever careful equilibrium had previously existed. Victoria had agreed to her remaining with visible relief, perhaps understanding that Miss Marple's presence lent a certain legitimacy and respectability to the proceedings. She had shown her to one of the guest rooms on the second floor, a charming space with floral wallpaper and a view of the now abandoned garden. Miss Marple had unpacked her small overnight case with methodical precision, then had made her way downstairs to the drawing room, where she settled herself with her knitting as though nothing extraordinary had occurred. It was there that Peter Ashford found her approximately an hour later. He had been released from police questioning, though Inspector Thornton had made it clear that he was not to leave the village pending further investigation. Peter appeared somewhat diminished by the events of the afternoon, his usual casual charm replaced by something more guarded and anxious. He poured himself a substantial whiskey from the decanter on the sideboard before acknowledging Miss Marple's presence. "Dreadful business," he said, settling into the chair across from her. Poor Gerald. Whatever else might be said about the man, he didn't deserve to be bludgeoned to death in the study of his employer. Miss Marple's knitting needles continued their steady rhythm. "You knew him quite well, then?" she asked pleasantly. "Not particularly," Peter replied, taking a generous drink. "He managed the estate, did his job competently enough. But there was something about him that rubbed people the wrong way, always poking into everyone's business, always asking questions about finances and arrangements, that sort of thing." "Curious," Miss Marple observed, "that someone so intrusive would be permitted to remain in such a position." Peter's expression shifted slightly, a momentary tension that suggested she had touched upon something significant. "Victoria valued his competence," he said carefully, even if his manner left something to be desired. Before Miss Marple could respond, they heard the sound of raised voices from the hallway. Simon and Victoria were engaged in what appeared to be a heated discussion, though both were attempting to maintain sufficient control to avoid alerting the police officers in the adjacent room. Miss Marple recognized the tone. The particular quality of argument that occurred between family members who had abandoned pretense and were addressing some long-standing grievance. "Cannot expect me to remain silent about this." Simon's voice carried clearly through the partially open door. "The man was corrupt, Victoria. We have evidence." "Hush!" Victoria's voice cut across his words with the sharpness of a blade. "This is neither the time nor the place. The police are already conducting their investigation. We must not complicate matters further." "Complicate matters?" Simon's laugh was bitter. Gerald was embezzling. He had been skimming funds for years. I found the discrepancies in the accounts weeks ago. I came to discuss this very issue with you, and instead he's dead, yes, Victoria said quietly. "And before you suggest anything foolish, let me be absolutely clear. Your discovery of those financial irregularities is now evidence that the police will inevitably discover. If you attempt to hide such information, you will only make yourself appear guilty of something far worse." The conversation seemed to conclude then, though Miss Marple could hear the sound of footsteps retreating. She noted that Peter had gone quite still in his chair, his whiskey glass paused halfway to his lips. When he finally looked at her, there was something different in his expression, something that suggested he had just understood that the murder of Gerald Whitmore was far more complicated than he had initially assumed. "You heard that," he said. "It was not a question." "I heard voices raised in discussion," Miss Marple replied without pausing in her knitting. "Nothing more, though I must say, it does paint rather a different picture of Mr. Whitmore than one might have formed from his position as estate manager." Peter set down his glass with careful deliberation. "Gerald was blackmailing people," he said quietly. "I don't know the details, but I suspected it. He had leverage over Victoria, something to do with money that went missing from the estate years ago. He used it to ensure his position remained secure despite his thievery." Miss Marple's needles continued their rhythmic clicking. "How very distressing for Victoria," she said mildly, "and how very interesting that his death should occur now, precisely when his fraudulent activities appear to have been discovered. One might almost think that someone had decided to eliminate a problem before it could grow any worse." Peter stared at her, and Miss Marple perceived the exact moment when he realized that she had understood something fundamental about the crime, something that extended far beyond the romantic complications or momentary passion that Inspector Thornton seemed convinced had motivated the murder. She returned his gaze calmly, her needles never pausing, and then she deliberately looked away, returning her attention to her knitting with the practiced indifference of someone who had said nothing of significance whatsoever. The night at Thornfield Manor settled into that particular quality of unease that follows violent death in a confined space. The grandfather clock in the main hallway chimed 11, and Miss Marple, who had retired to her guest room at a reasonable hour, found herself awake and alert despite the comfortable bed and the soft lamplight filtering through the curtains. She had learned long ago that sleep was often subordinate to observation, and tonight she had no intention of missing any developments that might occur. At precisely 12:30, she heard footsteps in the corridor outside her room. They were deliberate, careful steps taken by someone attempting to move without making unnecessary noise. Through the slight gap she had left in her door, Miss Marple observed Catherine Wynne pass by, dressed in a dark dressing gown and carrying something small and metallic in her hand. The girl moved toward the stairs with the purposefulness of someone engaged in a mission rather than merely seeking a late-night drink of water. Miss Marple rose from her bed, donned her cardigan over her nightgown, and followed at a discreet distance. She was remarkably adept at moving quietly for a woman of her age, a skill acquired through decades of village life where one often needed to observe without being observed. She descended the stairs carefully, keeping to the wall where the boards were less likely to creak, and found herself in the entrance hall just in time to see Catherine disappearing into Victoria's private study. The door to the study had been sealed with police tape, though it had not been locked. there being nothing of particular value remaining inside now that Gerald's body had been removed. Catherine had carefully peeled back the tape and entered the room. Through the window, Miss Marple could see the beam of a small torch sweeping across the interior, moving with apparent purposefulness toward the desk where Gerald had been found. Before Miss Marple could determine what Catherine's intentions might be, she heard another sound from the upper floor. Someone else was moving through the house, someone heavier and less cautious than Catherine had been. Miss Marple stepped back into the shadows of the hallway as Simon Ashford descended the stairs, still fully dressed despite the late hour. He too moved toward the study, and when he saw Catherine already inside, his expression darkened considerably. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, keeping his voice low but urgent. "The police sealed this room. If they discover you've disturbed evidence, I'm not disturbing anything," Catherine replied, straightening from whatever she had been examining. "I'm retrieving something that doesn't belong in this room, something that would only cause more difficulty if the police were to find it." "What?" Simon moved closer, and Miss Marple observed the tension in his posture. "Catherine, you must tell me what's happening. Are you involved in this? Did you—" "No." The word was sharp, definitive. "I did not kill Gerald Whitmore, but I know something that would make the police believe I did if they discovered it. There's a letter. Gerald wrote to me months ago, expressing certain intentions, threatening to reveal things unless I complied with his demands. I came here tonight to find it before the police discovered it among his personal effects." "He was blackmailing you." Simon's voice was filled with a mixture of anger and concern. "Why didn't you tell me? You would have done something foolish," Catherine interrupted. "You would have confronted him, and then you would have become the police's prime suspect, which, as it happens, you already are, though you don't seem to realize it." Simon stepped back as though she had physically struck him. "What do you mean?" "I mean that you were seen entering this room at 4:20 this afternoon. Not by me, but by someone who has already mentioned it to the police, though they haven't quite connected the timeline to the murder yet. Give them a day or two of investigation, and they will realize that you had opportunity and motive. The fact that you discovered Gerald's embezzlement gives you motive. The fact that he was involved with me gives you another motive. And the fact that you were alone in this room at approximately the time of death gives you opportunity." From her position in the hallway, Miss Marple observed Simon's face go very white. His hands had begun to shake, and he gripped the edge of the desk to steady himself. "I didn't kill him," Simon said quietly. "I came in here to confront him about the theft. I wanted him to confess so that I could report it to Victoria before she discovered it herself. But when I arrived, he was already dead. I knew how it would look, so I left immediately. I didn't touch anything. I certainly didn't touch that paperweight." Catherine's expression shifted slightly, a softening that suggested she had begun to believe him. "Then we need to find that letter," she said, "because if the police find it first, they will assume that Gerald's death resulted from his blackmail schemes, and that will lead them directly to me as a suspect, which will then lead them to you as someone connected to me through either romantic entanglement or murder." Simon finished bitterly. "Yes, I understand the logic." Miss Marple's mind was working with the precision of a well-oiled mechanism. The letter that Catherine sought, if it existed, would indeed complicate matters considerably. But more significantly, Catherine's revelation about Simon's presence in the study at the time of death was information that the police did not yet possess. And the fact that Catherine knew about Simon's presence suggested that someone had seen him enter the room and had either mentioned it to Catherine or had simply left the information available for her to discover, which brought Miss Marple to a rather uncomfortable conclusion. The person who had actually committed the murder was precisely the sort of individual who would allow suspicion to fall upon the innocent while protecting themselves through misdirection and careful omission. And that person, she suspected, was someone whose motive extended far beyond the simple romantic complications or financial irregularities that Inspector Thornton was so focused upon investigating. Miss Marple was not a woman given to dramatic intervention, but she recognized when subtlety had reached its practical limits. She stepped from the shadows into the study, her presence announced by the soft sound of her cardigan against the doorframe. Both Catherine and Simon startled visibly, though Catherine recovered more quickly, her expression shifting into something approaching defiance. "Miss Marple," Catherine said carefully, "I can explain—" "I'm quite certain you can," Miss Marple replied, her voice carrying the particular gentleness that made it simultaneously reassuring and entirely authoritative. "However, I think it would be considerably more productive if we were to have a conversation about what has actually occurred, rather than attempting to construct explanations for my presence here. Shall we move to the drawing room? I believe we might all benefit from sitting down." Neither Catherine nor Simon possessed sufficient authority to refuse such a request from someone of Miss Marple's age and status. They followed her out of the study, and once they had settled themselves in the drawing room, Miss Marple in her preferred chair, Catherine on the settee, and Simon standing with the restlessness of someone consumed by anxiety, Miss Marple began to knit. The familiar motion seemed to calm her thoughts and lend authority to her observations. "Now then," she said, without looking up from her needles, "let us establish what we know with reasonable certainty. Gerald Whitmore was engaged in financial fraud, skimming funds from the Iswaib estate over a period of years. He was also engaged in a more personal form of exploitation, leveraging information he possessed to secure compliance and silence from people he had power over. Catherine, you were one such victim. Victoria, I suspect, was another, though the nature of her vulnerability is not yet entirely clear to me. And Simon, you discovered the financial discrepancies through your examination of the estate accounts." "How could you possibly know all this?" Simon demanded. "You were outside the entire afternoon. You couldn't have—" "I listened," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "People speak more freely when they believe one is not paying attention. Your conversation with Victoria this evening was quite revealing, as was Peter's confession to me regarding Gerald's blackmail activities. But more importantly, I observed, the way Gerald looked at Catherine suggested more than simple estate management. The way Victoria became pale when discussing him suggested more than mere professional concern. And the way you, Simon, went very white when Catherine mentioned that someone had seen you enter the study suggested that you understood, in that moment, how perilous your position had become." Catherine leaned forward, her voice urgent. "Did you tell them? Did you tell the police that Simon was—" "I have told the police nothing," Miss Marple said firmly, "because I do not believe that Simon murdered Gerald Whitmore. However, I do believe that someone is actively engaged in ensuring that suspicion falls upon Simon, and I suspect I know precisely who that someone might be." She set down her knitting and looked directly at Catherine. "The letter you are searching for, the one Gerald allegedly wrote to you, does it exist?" Catherine hesitated, then slowly shook her head. "Gerald never wrote letters," she admitted quietly. "He was too careful for that. He kept his leverage oral, understood through implication and threat rather than documented evidence. But if Simon's presence in this room is known to the police, they might assume there was a letter, and they might believe that either of us destroyed it, which would make us both appear guilty of obstruction." "Precisely," Miss Marple said. "And that brings us to the question of who has been carefully positioning the pieces of this puzzle to ensure maximum confusion and maximum suspicion directed toward the young people in this house." At that precise moment, Victoria appeared in the doorway of the drawing room. She was fully dressed despite the hour, and her expression suggested that she had known precisely where to find the three of them. Behind her stood Inspector Thornton, who looked considerably less pleased about this late-night gathering than Victoria appeared to be. Inspector Thornton was kind enough to return to Thornfield to discuss some additional findings, Victoria announced. "I believe you will find his information quite illuminating." The inspector stepped forward, his expression apologetic. "I've just received the preliminary forensic report," he said. The paperweight that struck Mr. Whitmore was wiped clean of fingerprints, as we suspected. However, there were traces of blood found under the desk itself, blood that appears to have come from the perpetrator. We've determined the blood type, and it matches neither Mr. Whitmore's nor anyone we've tested thus far. Which means, Miss Marple observed quietly, that whoever struck Gerald Whitmore injured themselves in the process. A cut hand, most likely, from the sharp edges of the paperweight, or perhaps from contact with broken glass or some other object in the room. Victoria's expression remained composed, but Miss Marple observed the almost imperceptible tightening at the corners of her mouth. It was a small tell, but for someone who had spent 70 years studying human behavior, it was perfectly sufficient. "I believe," Miss Marple continued, rising from her chair with deliberate slowness, "that if Inspector Thornton were to examine the hands of everyone currently in this house, he would discover that one person bears fresh wounds consistent with the perpetrator's injuries. And I suspect that person is someone whose motive for killing Gerald extended beyond the simple matter of financial fraud or personal blackmail." She turned to face Victoria directly. "You knew about the embezzlement for some time, didn't you? Years, perhaps. And Gerald had been leveraging that knowledge, along with something else, something quite significant, to maintain his position and his ability to continue his thievery. But something changed. Something made it necessary for you to act, regardless of the consequences." Victoria's face had gone very pale, but her voice remained steady. "I'm afraid I don't understand what you're suggesting, Miss Marple." "I'm not suggesting anything," Miss Marple replied. "I'm merely observing that a woman of your age, your position, and your character would have very specific reasons for committing murder. And I suspect those reasons have considerably more to do with protecting someone you love than they do with protecting your own interests." The silence that followed Miss Marple's statement seemed to stretch across the drawing room like something physical, a barrier between what everyone had believed to be true and what was actually the case. Inspector Thornton had removed a small notebook from his pocket and was watching both Miss Marple and Victoria with the particular intensity of a man who suddenly realized that his investigation had taken a significant turn. "If you're suggesting what I believe you're suggesting," the inspector said carefully, "then I must caution you that such accusations carry considerable weight. Do you have evidence to support this theory, Miss Marple?" "I have observations," Miss Marple replied, settling back into her chair. "Whether they constitute evidence in the legal sense is, I suppose, a matter for you to determine. But I think it would be worthwhile to examine the progression of events rather carefully. Gerald Whitmore was killed at approximately 4:30 this afternoon. We know that Simon was in this room at 4:20. We know that Catherine was absent from the garden party for a period of time preceding that. We know that Peter remained in the garden throughout, but we have not adequately accounted for Victoria's movements during that critical 15-minute window." Victoria's hands, which had been folded neatly in her lap, suddenly curled into fists. The gesture was small but revealing, the first genuine break in her composed facade. "I went to speak with Gerald," she said quietly. "I had been waiting for an opportune moment all afternoon. When Simon came out of the house at 4:20 and appeared to be searching for someone, I realized that my window of opportunity was narrowing. The house was relatively empty. The police investigation would soon complicate matters considerably. So I went inside. And when you found him in the study," Miss Marple prompted gently. "He was alone," Victoria continued, her voice taking on a slightly hollow quality. "He had been reviewing some documents, financial records that he clearly intended to use as leverage. He looked up when I entered, and his expression suggested that he had been expecting someone. Not me, I think. But he recovered quickly. He began to smile, that peculiar smile of his, the one that suggested he knew all of one's secrets and found them endlessly amusing. Catherine had gone very still, and Simone had moved closer to her, as though proximity offered some form of protection. Inspector Thornton was watching Victoria with the complete focus of someone who had just begun to understand that his case was about to resolve itself in a manner he had not anticipated. "I asked him," Victoria said, "to tell me the truth about the financial irregularities. I knew about the embezzlement, you understand? I have always known. Gerald and I came to an understanding years ago, shortly after my husband's death. He discovered something about the estate, a substantial sum of money that had gone missing during my late husband's administration. Money that I had redirected to a charity for unwed mothers in the county town. Gerald threatened to expose this unless I permitted him certain accommodations regarding his own financial arrangements. So you allowed him to steal," Miss Marple said softly, "in exchange for his silence about your own charitable disbursements." "It wasn't theft in the way you might imagine," Victoria replied, and there was almost a note of desperation in her voice. "The estate is wealthy. Gerald's extractions, while substantial, were negligible in terms of impact. But more importantly, my own use of those funds was entirely legal, merely unconventional. However, exposing it would have caused considerable scandal. My husband's family would have been humiliated. The estate's reputation would have suffered, and more significantly, the charity that had been receiving those funds would have lost its primary source of support." "So you made a devil's bargain," Miss Marple observed, "and you lived with that arrangement for years. But something changed. Something made it necessary for you to risk everything by breaking that agreement." Victoria's eyes closed briefly, and when she opened them again, there were tears streaming down her face. "Simon," she said. "Last week Simon discovered the discrepancies. He came to me with proof of Gerald's theft, demanding that I allow him to report it to the police. He didn't understand the complexity of the situation. He didn't know about the charity funds, about my involvement in diverting estate money for purposes beyond the estate's conventional operations. You were afraid," Miss Marple said with complete understanding, "that if the investigation into Gerald's theft proceeded, it would eventually uncover your own financial irregularities. And you were equally afraid that Simon would be implicated, either as an accomplice or as someone who had discovered the crime and failed to report it immediately." "The boy was prepared to sacrifice himself," Victoria said, her voice breaking slightly. "He wanted to confess to covering up the theft, to claim that he had known about it for some time but had been too frightened to report it. He would have gone to prison. He would have destroyed his life to protect me." Simon made a small sound of protest, but Victoria raised her hand to silence him. She turned to face Inspector Thornton directly. "When I confronted Gerald in the study," she continued, "I told him that I could no longer maintain our arrangement, that I intended to confess to my financial diversions and accept the consequences. I asked him what he intended to do, whether he would also confess to his own theft, or whether he would attempt to use my confession as additional leverage." "And what did he say?" the inspector asked quietly. "He laughed," Victoria replied. "He laughed and told me that he had already prepared a document detailing my financial irregularities, and that if I attempted to confess, he would ensure that document was released to the family solicitors and the tax authorities. He had me trapped, or so he believed. He said that I would continue to permit his embezzlement, and in exchange, he would maintain his silence about my charitable work." Victoria's hands unclenched, and Miss Marple could see that the palms bore small lacerations, wounds consistent with having gripped something sharp in a moment of intense emotion. "I looked at him," Victoria said, "and I understood that there was no path forward that didn't lead to destruction, my own or Simon's or both. And I saw the paperweight on the desk, that beautiful brass thing that had been my mother's, and I couldn't accept that outcome. I couldn't accept that this man would continue to hold my life hostage. So I reached for the paperweight, and I struck him. Once. That's all it took. One moment of action, and everything changed." Inspector Thornton set down his notebook with the careful deliberation of someone who had just received a confession that resolved his case but complicated his conscience simultaneously. He signaled to Sergeant Mills, who had been stationed in the hallway, and the younger officer appeared in the doorway with the practiced efficiency of police procedure. There was no drama in what followed, merely the quiet professionalism of law enforcement conducting its necessary functions. Victoria Ashford, Inspector Thornton began, his voice taking on the formal cadence required by legal protocol. I must inform you that you are being taken into custody pending charges related to the death of Gerald Whitmore. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say? I understand my rights, Victoria interrupted quietly. She rose from her chair with the same composed dignity she had maintained throughout her confession. I have read enough detective novels to comprehend the procedures. I will require a solicitor, naturally, and I assume you will permit me to contact my family before we depart. Simon moved forward as though to embrace his aunt, but Victoria held up her hand in a gesture that was both protective and final. No, she said firmly. You will not involve yourself further in this matter. You will cooperate fully with the police, answer their questions with complete honesty, and you will permit your solicitor to handle all legal matters. Is that understood? Aunt Victoria. Simon's voice cracked with emotion. Is that understood? Victoria repeated, her tone brooking no argument. Yes, Simon said quietly. I understand. Miss Marple observed this exchange with the particular awareness of someone who had witnessed the end of a carefully constructed facade. Victoria had spent years maintaining control, managing crises, protecting those she loved through careful manipulation and strategic silence. Now, at the moment of her greatest vulnerability, she was still attempting to exert authority over the outcomes, still trying to protect Simon from consequences that were no longer hers to prevent or mitigate. Inspector Thornton conducted the formal arrest with the minimum of ceremony required. Sergeant Mills produced handcuffs, which Victoria regarded with what appeared to be academic interest rather than distress. As they prepared to lead her from the drawing room, Miss Marple spoke once more. The letter, Miss Marple said softly. The one Catherine was searching for. It never existed, did it? Gerald worked through implication and threat, as you suggested. Which means Catherine's presence in the study tonight was born from fear based on false assumptions. Victoria paused at the doorway and looked back at Miss Marple with an expression that suggested gratitude, though for what precisely remained somewhat ambiguous. Gerald kept detailed records, she said, personal records of his leverage over various individuals. Those records are in a locked drawer in his flat in the village. If you were to inform the police of this, they might discover that several people in Ashford in the Weald have considerably more pressing reasons to wish him dead than merely romantic entanglement or professional conflict. That information might, in some cases, prove useful in restoring certain reputations. With that cryptic statement, Victoria allowed herself to be escorted from the house. The sound of the police vehicle departing echoed briefly through the corridors of Thornfield Manor, leaving behind a silence that seemed to press upon everyone present with considerable weight. Catherine had begun to cry, not dramatically, but with the quiet desperation of someone who suddenly understood the magnitude of what had transpired. Simon sat down heavily in the nearest chair, his expression suggesting that the full implications of the afternoon's events were only now beginning to crystallize in his mind. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had returned to her knitting, her needles resuming their familiar rhythm as though nothing of significance had occurred. I don't understand, Catherine said finally, addressing Miss Marple directly. How could you possibly have known? I mean, I understand the deductions you made, but how could you have been certain? How could you have known with such clarity what everyone else was missing? Miss Marple paused in her knitting and considered the question with genuine thoughtfulness. I have spent 70 years in a small village, she replied. I have observed how human beings behave when they are frightened, when they are guilty, when they are protecting someone they love. Victoria Ashford carried all three of those emotional states in the way she moved, in the way she spoke, in the seemingly insignificant details of her demeanor. But more importantly, she bore the particular exhaustion of someone who had been living a lie for a considerable period of time. That exhaustion has a quality all its own. It leaves marks. "But the murder itself," Simon said, finding his voice again. "You understood it was Victoria immediately. You must have suspected from the beginning." "I suspected many things," Miss Marple corrected gently. "But suspicion and certainty are quite different matters. What confirmed my understanding was the simple fact that Victoria possessed both motive and means that extended beyond the surface complications. Gerald had leverage over her that went deeper than mere financial theft. He had leverage that threatened not merely her own reputation, but her entire family's future. And there is nothing quite so powerful as a motive born from the desire to protect one's children, or in this case, one's nephew. She set down her knitting and removed her spectacles, revealing eyes that were far sharper and more perceptive than their outward appearance suggested. "You see, Miss Wynne, the critical observation was not about what people did during the crime, but rather about what they were afraid people would discover afterward. Victoria's entire demeanor suggested someone engaged in protecting others from consequences, and once one understands that fundamental drive, everything else becomes quite straightforward." Simon and Catherine exchanged glances, and Miss Marple observed that something had shifted between them, a recognition perhaps that their relationship had been built partly on mutual vulnerability and partly on misunderstanding. Victoria's actions had inadvertently clarified matters that might otherwise have remained perpetually complicated. "What happens now?" Catherine asked quietly. "Now," Miss Marple said, rising from her chair with the careful deliberation of age, "we all return to our rooms and attempt to achieve some form of rest. Tomorrow the police will conduct their final interviews, and the machinery of justice will proceed according to its established protocols. Life in Ashford in the Weald will gradually return to something resembling normalcy, though with certain gaps and absences that will take considerable time to heal." She paused at the doorway and looked back at the two young people. "Victoria made her choice," Miss Marple continued. "She acted according to her understanding of what was necessary, what was right, what would preserve the futures of those she loved. That choice will have consequences, serious consequences, but it was, in its way, an act of profound love." 3 weeks had passed since Victoria Ashford's arrest, and the village of Ashford in the Weald had settled into that peculiar state of recovery that follows scandal and tragedy. The initial shock had gradually given way to something more complex, a mixture of sympathy and condemnation, understanding and judgment that varied depending on whom one happened to encounter on the high street or in the post office queue. Human nature, Miss Marple had always observed, was remarkably consistent in its inconsistency. She sat in her own cottage now, in her sitting room overlooking the garden where roses still bloomed despite the advancing autumn. The case, such as it was, had concluded with the efficiency that the legal system demanded. Victoria's solicitor had negotiated the details of her guilty plea, and a trial date had been set for the following spring. The evidence was conclusive, and there seemed little point in prolonging the proceedings through unnecessary courtroom drama. Victoria had killed Gerald Whitmore, and she had done so with the sort of deliberation that suggested premeditation rather than momentary passion. Yet the world was considerably more nuanced than such legal categorizations allowed. Inspector Thornton had visited Miss Marple 2 days previously, ostensibly to obtain her formal statement, but actually, she suspected, to seek her perspective on certain aspects of the case that troubled him. They had sat in this very room, drinking tea while he had asked careful questions about Victoria's character, her motivations, and whether Miss Marple believed justice had truly been served by Victoria's arrest. "She had no choice," Miss Marple had replied quietly. Or rather, she perceived no choice, which amounts to the same thing in practice. Gerald had constructed a trap that Victoria could not escape without destroying either herself or her nephew. She chose to destroy herself instead, Whether that constitutes justice or tragedy is largely a matter of perspective. The inspector had nodded slowly, as though confirming something he had already suspected but needed external validation to accept. He had also informed her, during that visit, that Inspector Thornton had indeed discovered Gerald's personal records in his flat, exactly as Victoria had suggested. Those records had revealed that several prominent citizens of Ashford-in-the-Weald had been subject to Gerald's blackmail schemes. The vicar's wife, it transpired, had maintained a correspondence with a woman in London that might have caused considerable scandal had it been discovered. The doctor had made certain financial irregularities in his practice accounts that he had been hoping to rectify quietly. Even Peter Ashford had been subject to Gerald's leverage regarding certain youthful indiscretions that Peter had believed long forgotten. In each case, Miss Marple had understood. Gerald had maintained control not through active exploitation, but through the simple threat of exposure. He had been a parasite of the most insidious variety, one whose primary function was simply to maintain his position through strategic silence and carefully calibrated intimidation. The question that remained, however, was one that Miss Marple had never articulated to anyone, but that occupied considerable space in her thoughts. Had Victoria Ashford actually committed murder, or had she merely acted as the agent of justice that the village itself had, in some collective and unspoken way, required? Catherine Wynne had departed Thornfield Manor the week following Victoria's arrest, returning to her family with a new understanding of human complexity and a certain wariness regarding the nature of romantic entanglement. She and Simon had exchanged letters. Miss Marple had learned through village gossip, though whether that correspondence would lead to rekindled romance or merely to amicable resolution remained to be seen. Simon had remained at Thornfield, assuming temporary control of estate affairs until Victoria's legal situation was resolved. He was working, according to reports, with considerable diligence to unravel the financial complications that Gerald's theft had created. More significantly, he seemed to be developing a genuine appreciation for the estate and the responsibilities it entailed, a transformation that Miss Marple found both promising and poignant. Peter Ashford had sold his cottage on the estate and departed for London, apparently determining that his position in Ashford-in-the-Weald had become untenable. Miss Marple had observed him leaving, his car laden with possessions, and she had felt a vague sense of sympathy for him. He was, after all, merely a man of moderate talents and limited prospects, struggling to maintain a role in a community that no longer required his presence. It was on a grey afternoon, approximately 4 weeks after Gerald's death, that Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. She was in her garden, examining the final blooms of her autumn roses, when the vicar's wife, whom she knew as Margaret, though they maintained the formality of using surnames in public, appeared at her garden gate. "Miss Marple," Margaret said, her voice carrying an undertone of emotion carefully controlled. "I wanted to thank you. I know what you did. I know that you could have revealed what you discovered in Gerald's records, and you didn't. Simon told me that you specifically asked the police to focus on Victoria's confession rather than on the broader implications of Gerald's blackmail activities." Miss Marple set down her pruning shears and regarded Margaret with the particular gentleness that came from understanding human vulnerability. "I did what I believed was necessary," Miss Marple replied. "Gerald Whitmore was, in many ways, a disease that had infected this village. Victoria Ashford, despite her crime, was motivated by something approaching nobility, the desire to protect those she loved. I saw no particular benefit in extending the investigation in ways that would cause additional suffering to innocent people." Margaret's eyes glistened with tears. "What you did was merciful," she said quietly. "And I wanted you to know that some of us understand that. Some of us are grateful." After Margaret had departed, Miss Marple returned to her roses. She pruned away the dead blooms with the same careful attention she had always applied to such tasks, understanding that in life, as in gardens, certain things must be removed to allow new growth. Victoria would face consequences for her actions, serious consequences that would reshape her existence and test her character in ways she could not yet imagine. But the village would survive, would perhaps even heal, carrying forward into the future with its secrets acknowledged, if not entirely resolved. Human nature, Miss Marple reflected as the sun descended toward the horizon, was remarkable not in its complexity but in its fundamental constancy. People acted according to their natures, their fears, their desperate attempts to preserve what they loved. Justice, true justice, required not merely the application of law, but also an understanding of the motivations that drove people to transgress against it. She had learned this lesson 70 years ago, and it had served her well ever since. The evening air grew cool, and Miss Marple gathered her pruning tools. Tomorrow the village would continue its routines, and in time the scandal would fade into the background narrative of Ashford in the Weald's history. Life would proceed as it always did, with people carrying their secrets and their sorrows, their small kindnesses and their quiet transgressions. And Miss Marple would be there, observing, understanding, and occasionally, when necessary, ensuring that justice, however imperfect, was ultimately served.